we go. I want to show you what we've laid out for you today. I have had some advance notice of the kinds of things that you are suggesting, that's been suggested that you'd like to hear about. Um, so now that we're through the introductions, our next step will be for me to give you a reflection question, something for you to think about as you consider what we're going to look at today. I'm going to tell you about the Community of Inquiry theoretical framework, which I understand was your request. It's quite a complex model. So in the short time we have together today, I can only, I can best give you the outline of the model, and then I will leave you with some resources for you to examine it further. Critical to using this model are the applications, actual pedagogical processes that support the emergence of a community within your classroom, whether it's in person or online. So we will discuss that. And then I really do want to break there and ask you to speak to the reflection question. I want to hear your question, and we'll discuss together, we'll discuss responses. So I hope that we can, for this brief moment in time, create our own little community of inquiry through our engagement today, won't say morning. And then I have some suggestions for you in terms of principles that underpin, I say blended teaching and learning because it does refer to online learning, to in-person learning, or a combination. And then we'll again have some time for discussion. So please do add your comments and questions in the chat, and let's be ready for this. So I want to suggest to you that the changes in education that are occurring and are going to continue to occur started quite a while ago and will continue. And so we have an opportunity, those of us who design and teach in higher education, we have an opportunity to create a vision for ourselves. And I'd like you to ask yourself, how will you be designing and delivering courses over the next 3 to 5 years? Long before the pandemic, we were beginning to notice that the way higher education is configured is not such a good fit for society anymore. So now this is a little more than 2 decades ago. Ickenberry said, the way we organize ourselves, our policies, our culture, what faculty do in the way we work, and those we serve must be reconsidered. This was the beginning of the major transformations. Derendorf, who you may know as a philosopher, social philosophers, called us stagnant universities. How rude. It was insulting for him to say such a thing about us, but perhaps we are, or we were. And he said we were expensive and ineffective monuments to a status quo, which is more likely to be a status quo ante, yesterday's world, preserved in aspic, which is like a jello. And then finally, Pond said, well, you know, we've got a system going that is serving students of the past. And the formal education that we're offering is historically based, but we must move on. I use this slide to demonstrate for people that prior to the pandemic, there were significant pressures on university systems to change. This information comes from someone named Duderstadt. Michael Duderstadt was the president of the University of Michigan for quite a number of terms. And he wrote in 2009 what he felt were the drivers for change as somewhat of a template to help us take a look at what the things we needed to attend to if we're going to configure a higher education that's much more aligned with the societies in which we exist. So at the bottom of this graphic, you will see three things that I think are particularly important for us to consider when we're looking at changing our delivery model, adjusting it, and learning some new teaching practices. It's the technology, the quality of instruction, and the student demographics and expectations. If you just put those three things together, we need to consider delivery methods that are beyond the transmission models, where we tell students what it is we want them to know. And through the use of technology, through looking at outcomes and the engagement that we have with students and who they are, that we can, in fact, create enhanced learning outcomes and prepare them for the world in which they're going to enter when they leave our programs. My last point on this slide is this. I spend my life, of course, focused on how the technology is changing, what that can do to serve students, how we can get better. But as I do that, I'm aware that all of those other things are happening at the same time. How can we be more accountable for our teaching? That's up at the top, demands for accountability. How can we make sure that we attend to the globalization and embrace our global diversity and be inclusive? What about financial support? What capabilities do we want students to have? So it's a big job ahead of us, and this was prior to the pandemic. John Dewey, I want to check my time here. John Dewey, now we're going even further back, sort of mid-century. John Dewey said that 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 education was guilty of a category mistake. And by that, what he meant was we're giving students the products of our inquiry as researchers. We hand off the products of our inquiry, and we're giving students the solutions rather than letting them investigate the problems and engage in the inquiry for themselves. So the community of inquiry model is very much based on what it is John Dewey said. There were others though, and it was his ideas were picked up, of course, by many people. Pierce, Royce, and who are working with Dewey, identified communities of inquiry as the best place for the advancement of knowledge. Now, of course, if you teach undergrads, the extent to which you're able to do this will vary because they have to have some base to work from. But it doesn't mean they can't be involved in what we would now refer to as a more active learning. And then a more current education theorist, Lippmann, said the importance of a community of inquiry is learning through critical reflection, is based on intellectual autonomy. So that critical reflection is most for a student then to be critically looking at what they do, what's being said to them, what's available for them to learn, what other people are doing, should be social and communal. That means that we want to have social engagement around the material and the learning. We don't want we're not expecting that in changing what we do from more passive delivery methods of transmitting knowledge to students, where we're engaging them in actively going through problem solving and research, that in fact they're focusing on doing that with other humans. It doesn't mean that they're spending all their time socializing together. So um, in the mid 90s, I was working on my PhD and studied the impact of social in the broadest sense of that word versus academic interaction on deep and surface learning, which, as you may know, was is a theory that was created by Martin and Solio from Sweden. Um, what we looked at measures of deep and surface learning beyond what Morton and Solio had done with the work of John Biggs. We studied approaches to learning and looked at how is it that interaction within the classroom and the content of that interaction can affect deep learning. And what I found was that it definitely can. And one of the things that's most critical is meaningful, content-based interaction, back and forth discussion with professors, of course. And then doing so with peers is a very close second. So Randy Garrison was on my committee while I was studying. And shortly after I was finished my PhD and this research, he moved to Edmonton and teamed up with Walter Archer and Terry Anderson and constructed this model. What there, you'll see right in the center of the graphic that what they were looking to construct was the most meaningful education experience for the student possible. So here is the shift away from teacher-centered content-based education delivery to looking at what the students are doing. If you ever get a chance to read the things that Randy Garrison has written or hear him speak, he will inevitably say the most important thing about teaching is what it is you're getting the students to do. So within this model, they have at the very center the construction of a deep, meaningful education experience for the students. What does deep mean? Well, it means that they're not just taking in what's being given to them, but they're integrating it. They are reflecting on it and considering how it works, not only in the broadest sense of the subject, but what does it mean for their lives? How are they going to be with this material and so on? Then in this Venn diagram that I'm sure you'll be familiar with, there are three critical elements. The first is social presence. And again, I want to make sure you're clear that we're not talking about having parties with our students, although that might be fun as well. This is to be socially present means to be a real human in the environment, but you are socially working with the material and each other in a community or the course of study, and you're communicating purposefully in a trusting environment. So this is safe, developing interpersonal relationships, but through the use of the material. And of course, is there some social interaction, some niceties, some maybe some personal talk about things that aren't too private, but that gives you a sense of community as well. So from that climate setting where you feel socially comfortable, you move into something called cognitive presence. This is that academic interaction that I looked at all those years ago. Cognitive presence is the extent to which learners are able to construct and confirm meaning by reflecting and talking about the material in a critical, we'll say, community of inquiry. By critical, we mean having students discuss the material without just accepting it for what it is, but looking at it very carefully and asking questions and how do we know And how does this work? How does it apply? And then finally, the third very important element is actually teaching presence. You'll notice that we don't say teacher presence, and there's a reason for that. In this community of inquiry, we come together as a group of teachers and learners. So through designing, facilitating, and providing direction around social presence and cognitive presence, the main instructor, which is you, along with their sous chefs, if you will, their sub instructors, which are the students, they purposefully realize a meaningful and educational, worthwhile learning experience and outcomes. So teaching presence means that there's a lot of back and forth of teaching and instructing each other, that students are working together. There may be peer assessment, but there's certainly peer support. And it's critical that the students be afforded the opportunity to try and teach something. The adage, if you really want to learn something, try and teach it, applies in this model. Please note that there are overlaps everywhere. And it's one of the areas of the model that we're just starting to pay a lot more attention to. But most critical is for you to consider the main three elements of this and how it is we take these ideas, these notions of types of presence, and bring them together in so that everyone is working together. This can be done. Of course, the model was written in initially for online environments that were strictly text-based. It has moved on in a significant way, and I'm going to tell you about what's been written more recently about how this model applies in person, online, or some combination of both. So, Lars, can we take a moment here? Just if I could stop there, I think that's enough of me talking for a moment. Can I ask our participants if there are any comments they would like to make, if you have any questions at this time, and if you have any answers yet to the reflection question, what will your teaching look like in 3 to 5 years?
Yes. Well, you asked how we think we're going to do it in 5 years. And I think something that has been my key point last 10 years, but also being a program director, is what do you do the first semester? What activities? How do we design everything? Well, it will make consequences to both me as teacher and fellow teachers, and mostly the students. And that is, I think, is a major issue, problem, experience, or whatever you might call it. If I'm heading the first course, then obviously it's easy to set this climate and put the student in the middle. But if I don't have the opportunity, if I have to sort of be a teacher the third or second or fourth semester, then it's really, really hard changing, because being put in the middle is really uncomfortable if you're not used as being a student, if you're not used to it. And we passivate our student. I feel it's very, very hard, and it's quite common. And what do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
So it's such a good question, and it is something that that we grapple with in my program as well. And we are in effect now, particularly with the pandemic, in what I would call a cultural lag. And so from the research that I'm reading, we had another study that just came out yesterday from OECD saying that the students are reporting a great interest in the convenience and flexibility, that they've had being able to work from home and being in online environments when they hadn't, whether they've experienced it before or not. While the teachers are much more likely to be saying, oh, no, I want to go back to the classroom. So we're in this cultural lag. We're going to have expectations from students. Now, what you're describing, I believe, is that same lag that can occur within a program where you have many different instructors. So if you, at the beginning, if you are one of the instructors at the beginning of the program, or you're the program director and you offer orientation and work for the students that does help them build a community, and then they get to an instructor 4 terms later who lays down the law and says, nobody's talking, we've got to get through all this material, then the students are surprised. But what I have noticed has happened in my experience is that the students will continue that communal learning on their own. So my short answer, and you're raising such a good question, we could have a good chat about it, that the students are very resilient and that it would be better to offer them, especially in the beginning, some understanding of what it means to be an active, self-directed, self-guided learner, so that they can do that themselves no matter what environment they end up in. In fact, so now when the first thing I teach in any course I'm teaching, whether it's leadership or instructional design or research or statistics, I teach this first. I spend the time that it takes to teach them about the community of inquiry and say, here's how I designed this course, and here's what would be best for you to engage with this kind of a design. And I actually think whether you use this model or not, whatever your expectations are, that you start every course with a discussion about what those expectations are, what would be best for them to be able to do, help them set up their study processes. So my short answer is, if you are going to have some teachers who are changing their model and allowing for more active participation of students and some who don't, the students will make it happen for themselves. And but there may be a little more pressure on those teachers who need to add perhaps more activity in their courses, but I don't think it's a good idea for us to require or put a lot of pressure on teachers to teach in a certain way, because I think unhappy teachers have a hard time being good teachers as well.
Marti, there are a few questions. One from Lena. Did you or others use this model to strengthen the teacher's own learning and competency faculty development in a similar way as you use the model to strengthen the students' learning? That obvious. So, I mean, just briefly about that before you continue.
Yeah, absolutely. There we have, so I work with and still work with Randy Garrison, who's retired now, and Norm Vaughn, who's also one of Randy's former students and quite involved in the model. And we offer workshops and so on when it's invited. So absolutely, we are now, because of a recent program review, a declared community of inquiry shop. So all of our instructors are reading about and discussing together how best to offer this. So yes, and if we can, in the best possible situation, we create communities of inquiry for faculty to allow them to learn about the community of inquiry.
Right.
So shall we continue? Are there more questions?
Yeah, about halfway, so.
Okay, thank you. Underneath these main elements of the model are subcategories. These are important when you start thinking about what will I do? What will the students do? What's in this design? So social presence requires, if you want social presence to emerge and this feeling of comfort and engagement, um, it's helpful to spend some time on offering opportunities for open communication. That means that the students can um, form the questions, they can make comments themselves, do presentations, and so on. That way, the open communication means it's a safe place to say what you're really thinking. After I teach the community of inquiry, I set rules, I will say norms with the students, and they help me design these. How will we communicate together? And so we come up with lists like we will respect each other. We will make sure everyone participates. We'll share the airtime. There'll be time in every engagement to talk, etc. Group cohesion is the second piece. Now, here's where we're really getting into you as a teacher developing the whole person. And I know that this is quite a significant shift in thinking. And I forget this a lot. Even at this point in my development, I still have to remind myself that I'm not just teaching statistics, that I'm working with the people who are before me, my students, to help them get into position so they can learn and grow. So that means some of my teaching now is about teaching learning and about setting up the in the ideal environment for learning. The second part of social presence is making sure there's some group cohesion. What does that mean? Well, some of you are engineers. You know that the strength of any structure has to do with the ways in which the elements are connected to one another. So group cohesion means you have a comfortable place for the individuals to group together and that they feel some connection to each other. That can happen in all kinds of ways. You can start your courses with introductions, ways for them to get to know each other. If you're doing this online, it's easier because you can set up spaces where people can put up a photo, show pictures of their dogs, their kids, where do they live. Not private information, um, but but information about them as a human being. And then finally, there needs to be opportunity for the students to, again, be who they are. How does that happen? Well, through presentations, through opportunities to dialogue, through opportunities to contribute to the group cohesion. Maybe they help with your help, they help themselves to group projects. Cognitive presence is based on a practical inquiry model that's made up of these 3 steps. Someone, usually, and especially in the beginning, you as the instructor, offers a trigger event, a video, something to read, some questions, some activity, a walk in a forest if you're in biology, some sort of trigger that kicks off the stimulation and the cognitive engagement we need to create space to start learning. Then there's exploration, where you're bringing in this is where all your facts come in, all of the interesting information about the subject that you're studying. The next thing has to do with assimilation of learning. These are long-standing learning theories. The integration of this exploration, these facts and information that you're getting, has to do with us attaching the new things that you're learning with the old things. That integration is a critical piece in support of memory and application. And then finally, help them close the inquiry. You know, as a researcher, that at some point, there's always more to learn. When we finish our research, we usually have more questions than we do answers. But in order for the learning, the thinking to be structured, you need to close it or help the students close it. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you, as the experts, say, okay, you have learned enough for now. You will be doing other things later that look like this. But at this, we're going to close this inquiry so they can set it aside and get ready for whatever the next thing is. And then finally, teaching presence it's made up of these three things: design and organization. What materials will you use? How diverse will those materials be? When will you offer them? In what order? How will the students work with these materials? That's design and organization. When it's possible, and it isn't always, but when it is possible, students can add to this. They can bring in materials, they can suggest exercises, they can ask to do certain things that are most meaningful to them. And then the facilitation of discourse, of course, this is you managing the conversations. Make sure in the design and organization, there's opportunity for those conversations, but someone also has to facilitate that. Make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. Make sure that when people do speak, they're acknowledged for what they've said. And then finally, you will have the opportunity to build some of those wonderful lectures that you've been doing, perhaps in shorter time frames. Perhaps they will be video lectures, but there will be times when you, as the content expert, will have to instruct directly. I will make sure that, well, Lars has these slides, and I hope that you will take a moment to go over them again after. I have created 3 slides that talk about the application exercises and activities for each of these 3 presences. I'll just highlight a couple on each of the slides that refer to individual presences. One of the things that helps bring a group together is to be really explicit about the fact that you're watching the group grow. So one of the ways to foster a safe and well-constructed climate in your learning community is to make it explicit and talk about it and check on it. How are you doing today? How are you feeling coming to class? Is this, do you feel like you can say what you have to say, and so on? Another one that's important is, as I said earlier, I set the norms with the students, but I do go back and make sure that we check on those norms to make sure they're still applicable. And finally, I'll just say, if you are going to be in a position where you do want to blend, so you're going to have online spaces and structured activities, make sure that those structures and the online spaces include opportunities for students to interact, that it isn't just a flat material description or presentation. Humans are always thinking. We're always thinking about something. And so being in this environment means, again, I'm going to suggest making the idea of thinking explicit. It's called metacognition. And you can tell the students about what it is you're trying to get them to do and what you'd like them to spend time thinking about, as well as ask them to to suggest what you should be thinking about, what other students should think about. So offer opportunities for the students to talk to each other about their thinking. It's called shared metacognition, and it's a very important part of continuing active engagement with the material, especially where they're struggling. Make sure the course activities and assignments require this reflection, some application, and even critique. Ask you to justify how it is you know what you know. Oh, my slide doesn't want to move here. Just a second. There we go. Teaching presence is the force that drives everything else that's going on. And I think, again, you can be explicit about sharing some of this role, obviously not all of it. And the students don't want you to do that because you are responsible for assigning grades. But you can tell them explicitly that you encourage and support their teaching of each other under the right conditions. There are times in some of my classes where I suggest that they may want to wait before they're spending too much time talking to each other. There isn't too much critique on a regression equation right now, although there is some depending on where you are. And sometimes the students may lead each other astray. You want to be careful about that. However, the extent to which you can foster the teaching and learning work that's going on between the students is the extent to which you can spend your time facilitating the learning rather than doing the direct instruction. So we take another short break. I'm watching the time. We take another short break here, and I ask you this question. So all the things I'm suggesting here are to make the learning more of an active, dynamic, flexing, shifting environment, so that the students are coming in ready to work and engage, not ready to sit down and just listen and take notes, but instead ready to actually do things. What is it you do now that's already part of this inquiry-based communal teaching and learning that you'll want to preserve in your future teaching?
Gunvor, and then also Lotta, who maybe wants to raise a question live, which is the usage of, but I don't know, Gunvor.
I think mine fits in nicely with the prior question. I think I really enjoyed the answer, Marti. I just realized that this is going to be the exam of my first course this autumn in psychotherapy. So we're going to start on a reflection on the different presences will be the exam. And I think that's a brilliant start. Starting at being a psychotherapist, I think it's sort of nice if you reflect. So this will be a good start, hopefully. So thanks a lot for the good, brilliant idea.
You're so welcome. It's a great application.
And Lotta, you have thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I can say one more. My question is more how to use this model. Because you told about using it to explain the course to the students. You can use it to analyze your course, of course, but is it also a method how to design a course?
I will show you before we finish some of the resources you can look at that give more instructions for the actual design. So like designing any course, you need to have objectives and desired outcomes. And then what you do is start piecing in sets of activities and timelines that move you into a particular direction. If you want to create a community of inquiry with a course, the front end has to have some outcomes that refer to making it clear to the students what the expectations are for them to be involved in the course. In fact, I think that's a good idea, whatever model you're going to use, that you set up explicitly with the students at the front end what the expectations are, what activities you expect them to be involved in, and so on. When it comes to designing a course that's based on the community of inquiry, there is a debate about whether you start with the social presence activities first. So what you do is you choose a presence. Cognitive presence isn't the way to start, I suggest, but you're going to be involved in the design and organization right from the front. So some of the theorists will tell you you start with teaching presence, and that means right at the beginning you put into place some opportunities to work with the students to shape the design of the course. A second design imperative for teaching presence is for you to make sure you build in regular opportunities for this kind of interaction. And then the third thing, of course, is that you create spaces and the ways you're going to present the material. So that's your direct instruction, which is part of teaching presence. So the short answer to your question is that you design presence by presence. And so you have to make sure wherever you start that you have created activities in the course and you've presented you've have attached those activities to the right material. You start with one and then you build in the activities that are required for the others. So I gave you those application suggestions presence by presence, but they do have to be integrated. What else do we do in instructional design? It's critical that your assessment, I think there's two things that's critical for assessment. If you want more student autonomy, you have to give them choices. And choices around the assessment, the demonstrations of their learning are very helpful. The diversity in our student intellectual styles, their capacities and so on are vast. So, and I when I started writing assessments for my courses, I had not learned anything about assessment. And that makes it very difficult. You end up using assessment tools that are based on what you've known about, and we're heavily focused on examinations, which is one way for students to demonstrate their learning. But the long-term impact of exam-based assessments of learning is quite small. Unless that learning that was done that you presented on the exam is then applied and continued. We've all experienced this. So when you're doing your design and you are creating your assessments, consider other ways for students to demonstrate what they've learned, not just what you think it's absolutely critical that they have to demonstrate. And some of that, if you're a nurse or an engineer, some of that has to be. But the more you can offer choices and the actual demonstration of what they've learned, not just on an exam where they write down what they can remember that day and what they studied because you told them it's likely to be on the exam, but application assessments. So I hope that's helpful. That was a bit of a globe trot around all the things that are important. but there are very specific things that have to become part of what you're going to do if you want a community of inquiry to emerge in your classroom.
We have 5 minutes left. Jonte raised your hand to begin with, and then we have 1 or 2 questions in the chat to end off with.
My question was more an answer to Marti's question, what I want to keep in my education in future, or I hope some maybe else keep, because I'm about near retirement. But what I would like to keep is like this design projects which I have in engineering, especially when you talk just about applying knowledge, and where you have really, when it works good, you have also like a community of inquiry. So I hope that not goes away with distance education or digitalization, but it has to develop. Of course, you learn students to use new tools, but the challenge is in, as Marti said, in assessment, because we have this on group contra individual, or if they just grade the finished product when the students conquer and divide and doesn't work as a group. So there are many challenges, and sometimes, there are some research shown that when teacher assesses in can we say in the wrong way, or not saying that, well, you should work together, then gives grade on the finished product. Well, students learn, we are not supposed to do what you say.
Right.
At least not
We're
the grading is not.
It's cheating. Yeah, it's a great example, and something like design-based learning does have a lot of those components. So again, I would say the students have to be taught how to work together to create designs. Isn't that what they're going to be doing when they leave us anyway? That they need the opportunity to sit with each other and work out how they're going to work together, rather than just letting how they're going to work together evolve as they go along. Do it ahead of time. It's like any other kind of planning. So I do hope you continue that. That's great.
So maybe we can just end off with a question that you and I, Marti, have discussed quite a lot. It's from Lena about which are the biggest differences between problem-based learning and community of inquiry, advantages, disadvantages. And Lotta added there, yes, perhaps PBL is a method to apply community inquiry. So, I mean, just a few thoughts on that as to end off this webinar.
So I will just quickly say that you're absolutely right. What constitutes a well-applied problem-based learning design, excuse me, has very many components that we recommend in the community of inquiry. And you will find that in almost anything that you're doing, that you will in fact have pieces of this model at play. And again, I'm not selling anything. I do think we have measurement tools that are attached to the model that you can use to help you with the design. And in reference to problem-based learning, it actually is one of the ways that you could, the integration of the two of those things, I think, would be very valuable. So I do have just a last couple of slides. Is it okay if I just take a couple of seconds to do that, Lars?
Of course, I mean, it's up to everyone. It's formally 5 o'clock now, but shall we let Marti just show her last slide? I think so. I would love that. And then we can end off. So you can share your screen, Marti.
What I want to show you is that if you have these slides and you click on our name there, this is an open source book we have designed 7 principles of blended and online learning. The person who asked me about the design, this book is actually an entire book. It's free. You can download it freely. And it gives you a step-by-step process for considering the design. And in reference to the problem-based question, you can take a look at this and see where problem-based learning applies, where it goes beyond that, and maybe some of the things that are missing in the community of inquiry that rest on problem-based learning that you want to make sure you include. The model was constructed 20 years ago, and not enough, Randy suggests not enough people are looking at the most recent work. So this is a book that he wrote in 2017 that integrates all the research that's been done since the model was first created, which is actually thousands of articles, but he has tried to synthesize all of that. So if you really want to study the model, it's actually, it's not an overwhelming book, but it's definitely worth reading if you do have interest in this. And then finally, this is also open source and free. I wrote a guide to blended learning, which is based on the community of inquiry. And I just wanted to make sure you were aware of those things so you have other places to go if you do want to continue your exploration of this model. So thank you all so much for the invitation. I've enjoyed our short visit together. I wish you well, and perhaps our paths will cross again.